Hello, welcome to the second lecture in our series on English grammar, leading into the ultimate series of lectures on Middle Egyptian grammar. Originally, I was planning to have just one lecture on English grammar, but I felt that the subject of phrases, clauses, and sentences was both important enough and needed enough for future reference. One might want to come back to this video, that it merited its own separate video so that it would not bloat out the runtime of the first one too much. A phrase in technical usage, because there's a common usage that doesn't exactly mirror this, is a group of words that functions grammatically as a single unit. For example, already discussed are prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrases operate as either an adjective or an adverb, depending on the specific phrase, what it's being used as, etc. But the point is that a prepositional phrase just acts as a single word, even though it's actually comprised of a bunch of them. Similarly, a noun phrase is one or more nouns or pronouns combined with conjunctions and any associated adjectives. So, for example, you and I is a noun phrase. It operates as a single noun for all intents and purposes. The cat and the dog, again, noun phrase. And this only works with coordinating conjunctions: and, or, but, nor, not. Does not work with words like if. You can't use that to create a noun phrase. A verb phrase is a verb, or very rarely two verbs attached with coordinating conjunctions, its objects, if any, and its adverbs. Remember that a verb can take a direct or indirect object, something we're going to go into more detail about in a moment, and of course can have adverbs modifying it, and the verb phrase is just all of that attached together. This is not something you'll see replacing a verb ordinarily. It's more important for sentence structure, but it is treated at the highest level as a unit. Now, an object is a noun phrase, so a noun, a pronoun, or a group of nouns bound to something else. Typically a verb, sometimes a preposition. There are two kinds of objects a verb can take. Most verbs, the class of verbs known as the transitives, take direct objects. And the direct object is the recipient of the action of the verb. So, for example, if one were to say, I hit him, him would be the object. And you note that you have to use a different form. You can't say he, you have to say him because it's an object. The indirect object is who or for whom the action is done. Only a few verbs take indirect objects. Commonly, the verbs send and receive, or send and give, are used with indirect objects. So if you were to say, I sent her a letter, in that sentence, the letter is the direct object, it's the thing being sent, but her is the indirect object, it's being sent to her. There are a few other examples. They're more common in other languages than in English, but we do have them. Both of these also show up in Egyptian. And then, of course, you have the objects of prepositions, which we already talked about. A clause is a noun phrase and a verb phrase. It can also take conjunctions on top of that can govern it. The noun phrase in a clause is called the subject. The verb phrase is called the predicate. And all sentences are composed of these clauses. So you have some sort of noun phrase, so articles, adjectives, pronouns, nouns, and any conjunctions combining them. And then a verb phrase. Your verb, or sometimes verbs if you have like helping verbs, or you have multiple actions being described, the objects of those verbs, if they have any, the adverbs and prepositional phrases associated with the verb, that kind of thing. And clauses fall into two categories, which are independent and dependent clauses, which we'll get into in a minute. Now, all clauses fall into one of 5 categories. Sometimes these are listed as the types of sentences. Really, they're the types of clauses. You can have a clause composed of the subject, a linking verb, and a predicate nominative. Now, you already know what its subject is. We've already been over the linking verb. The predicate nominative is something very interesting. It does not really come up in Egyptian, at least the nominative part. The predicate nominative is a noun or pronoun being equated with the subject in this type of clause. It requires a linking verb, and it is not an object. Nothing's governing it. It's just equal to the subject. You could flip the order of the predicate nominative and the subject, and the meaning would not be changed. As such, the predicate nominative does not use the object pronouns. If you're dealing with pronouns, it uses the subject pronouns. So if someone were to call you on the phone and they asked, oh, is it your name? You would say, yes, it is he, it is she, it is they. Or I am he, I am she, I am they, rather than him, her, them. The second type of sentence, also with linking verbs, is when a linking verb is attaching an adjective. In that case, your adjective is called the predicate adjective. But other than that, there's no real differences. Then you have three types of clauses that deal with active verbs. Some verbs are intransitive, they don't take subjects. Or among the active verbs, this generally means a verb of motion, and specifically motion from point A to point B. Some verbs do this only some of the time. The verb drive, for example, if I were to say I drove home, there's no object. Home, in this case, is an adverb. But if I said I drove my car home, then my car becomes the direct object. Other verbs that don't involve a method of transportation always appear in sentences of this form. Walk, go, etc. Verbs that just mean to travel from one spot to another. And there may be a few other verbs that fall in that category, but these are the vast majority. And there are also actually, yes, a few that refer to states of being. One could say that someone died without any object involved, for example, or to be born or that kind of thing. Then we have the verbs that do take a direct object, and this is the majority of sentences you run into in English. Subject, your action verb, and the direct object, and then ones that also take an indirect object. In English, the indirect object always precedes the direct object. In Egyptian, it's a little complicated. We'll get into that when the time comes for it, because while the basic types of sentences are broadly the same, we'll get into in a minute, but Egyptian does lack linking verbs for the most part, and the order of the indirect object and direct object relative to one another can sometimes get a little complicated about whether you're using pronouns or nouns. It is a little easier in English, but we will go over that when the time comes. Dependent clauses are a clause, so you have to follow those rules, but they begin with a subordinating conjunction. These include the conditionals like if, or the ones of time, the conjunctions of time like when or after or during. And they cannot stand on their own. You can't just say if the sun doesn't rise, period. That would not constitute a full sentence. This is said sometimes, generally in a particular context where you can imply the independent clause that comes with it. But in proper grammar, it needs to be tied to an independent clause in order to form a sentence. Otherwise, it's outside of the rules of grammar. A sentence is the largest unit of grammar. It consists of an independent clause, which is a clause that does not have any of those subordinating conjunctions, just one of our patterns like this, nothing else, and some additional clauses. Additional clauses are not mandatory, but they do often appear. These include more independent clauses, which are bound with coordinating conjunctions like and, or but, or in English, you can also count sentences bound with semicolons. A semicolon acts like a coordinating conjunction, but is not said out loud. But this is not something we have to worry about with Egyptian, because Egyptian does not have any punctuation. And then you have dependent clauses bound with subordinating conjunctions that can also be attached to your independent clause, either before it, after it, whatever. Compound sentences is a sentence that includes two or more independent clauses. A complex sentence includes a dependent clause, and compound complex sentences have both. That's all we need to know as an overview of English grammar to start delving into the Egyptian. Now, this is not everything there is in English grammar. We can go a lot deeper, but we don't need a perfect understanding of it, just an idea of the kind of vocabulary we're going to be using and the general grammatical concepts so that we can use them to meaningfully discuss ancient Egyptian. We do have one more hurdle to cross before we get into the language, though, which is we need a bit of historical overview and context, because it will make some of the examples make more sense and generally give you a knowledge of what it is you are learning through the study of ancient Egyptian. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.